and so he asked me to do this, and the rest of the summer, part of the summer, I guess it's going to be a few weeks out. We'll be doing some more of these Wednesday night sessions together. And one of the things I started, does anybody need one of these? Tim can hand them out to you. Anybody need a handout? It's a long, like 3 pages. And I don't think we'll get through all of it tonight. We might, I don't know. Depends on how many questions and how much discussion we have. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today, and we haven't really done this in a while, is some apologetics stuff. That is discussions about defending the faith. The Bible tells us we ought always to be ready to give an answer of the hope that's in us. And a lot of times in our modern culture today, you're going to come across people, you're going to come up to people are going to talk with you who are very antagonistic towards God. And that can sometimes take you off guard, and that can make you surprised if you're not ready for that. Some definitions, let's start at the top, some definitions here. An atheist, and this is important to understand, and I think this might be helpful to you. An atheist is someone who believes God does not exist. Okay? This is not merely someone who doesn't believe God exists. They actually have an affirmative belief, that is, I believe God does not exist. That's what they would say. That's what an atheist is. Whereas an agnostic, you might have someone say, well, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. And what they mean by that, it might not mean much practically, the difference between the two, but they're going to be more squishy on this, in the sense they're going to say, well, I don't believe you can know. I don't know whether God exists, they will say that, or they'll say, I don't believe you can know whether God exists. Agnostic comes from the Greek word for knowledge, gnosis, and it also has the A on the front, which many of you know is the not prefix. So, no knowledge. It means I'm non-committal. It means I don't know. So what has changed? What has brought talk about atheism or these kind of topics? What has brought this? What has made this so different? Or not so different? What has made this become something we ought to address more urgently? Any ideas? In the past, say, few years, 10, 20? Media. Okay, in what way? The people have been pushing subjective morality, subjective truth for a long time. That fits right in with atheism. People's educational beliefs all the times are fit in this. I think a big one has to be the internet, and the propagation of atheism on the internet is huge. Students, young people in the college age and even high school age are being inundated with information, inundated with videos, multimedia, arguments from atheists that often are very bad arguments. And they would never have made it into a book or on TV or on a magazine years ago, because editors would have been like, that's a terrible argument. But the problem is, because the internet is everybody's playground, everybody can do whatever they want, they can say whatever they want. Often young people aren't discerning, and they don't understand what's being argued, and they fall into believing really bad arguments. I can say from my experience on reading and watching atheist stuff online, there's not a lot of really great stuff out there as far as really good arguments. A lot of the arguments are very poor. There are some very smart people, but there are still a lot of bad arguments. So let's talk about questions about God. Oh, I forgot to roll through my thing. That's what we got here, atheist and an agnostic. Let's talk about questions about God. This is the most fundamental thing about Christian belief, is our belief in a personal and a moral God. If you don't believe in God, you can be a lot of things, but you cannot be a Christian. Okay, so in order to be a Christian, you have to believe in God. There might be atheist Jews, but there are no atheist Christians. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but there are such things as atheist Jews. Having a moral God is also essential to the Christian faith. There are those who are antagonistic towards the Christian faith. They often start with doubt over the existence of God himself. Of course, not just talking about whether God exists is going to bring someone towards faith in Christ, but it might help clear away any objections they have in their mind. So I have 2 goals for you tonight. First is to equip you to deal with those who object to the true God of Scriptures, and 2, to inspire you to engage with those who might be antagonistic towards your worldview. Some of you don't like to fight. You don't like to argue, and you're like, look, just let's all be friends, and let's not argue, let's not engage, let's not talk about this. I don't want to have an argument. I don't want my blood pressure to go up. I don't want to get in a situation where I might not know what to say. I don't want to become uncomfortable, whatever the case is for you. But some of you like to discuss and like to argue. And so I'm trying to help those of you who maybe are a little more timid to feel bold to be able to talk to people about these things, even if you're not an expert. There are some very simple things you can talk about. First thing we're going to discuss tonight is the question about, does God exist? So you're not going to be able to prove it to anybody that God exists. The most we can hope to do is provide evidences for God's existence that can cumulatively have an impact on whether on helping someone think through these discussions. So first, there are 4 classical arguments for the existence of God, 4 traditional or classical arguments for the existence of God. I have them listed for you. Does anybody remember? I guess I have them written out for you, but the first one is called the what? The cosmological argument. That's the argument from creation. There's some blanks you can fill in here. The argument from creation, the cosmological argument. Cosmos means world or universe, roughly. It's a Greek word. All these come from the Greek. Cosmological argument. And if it's too hard to remember, just think the argument from creation. There's another argument, and that is the argument from design. Argument from design. That's the teleological argument. The word telos has to do with the purpose or an end. So it has to do with the design for something, how something was designed. We'll get into that. There's also an argument from moral law. It's 2 words, moral law. And that's called the axiological argument. Axia has to do with the idea of value or worth. So in morals, we place certain things at value over others. So the axiological or the argument from moral law. And lastly, there's the argument from being, B-E-I-N-G, being, or the ontological argument. Ontos comes from the Greek word that means be or to be. It's one of the forms of that Greek word. So these are the 4 classical arguments. How many of you are very familiar with all 4 classical arguments? Okay, 1, 2. I know Charles is. Okay, Thomas says he's aware of all 4 classical arguments. A couple of these guys should know, right? I'm not gonna embarrass you. You don't have to worry about that. We're going to start with a cosmological argument tonight and talk through some of this stuff. This is not necessarily as strict a Bible study as maybe you're used to, but I figure, hey, it's good to change things up every once in a while. So let's get started talking about the cosmological argument, which is the argument from creation. I'll probably use the word cosmological argument more than the term argument from creation. Let's look at some verses here. We have 2 here. Would anybody like to read Genesis 1:1 for us, or cite it from memory? Recite it? Anybody? How about one of the kids? You can do it? Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is a very serious start to the Bible. When you think about all the things that includes. In the beginning, it means there's a start. It means the universe is not eternal. It means the universe is not cyclical. It means the universe has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It means there's a purpose for where things are going. In the beginning, God. God is eternal. He's existence. It doesn't say he came into existence. It says he is. God created. God acts. God does. And he creates something other than himself. Right? He creates something. We are his creatures. There's so much theology bound up in those few words right there. And Colossians 1:17. Yes, sir. In the back. Chris. Good. And we'll talk about this more later, but this has to do with the argument that there has to be a purpose or there has to be a cause for things to continue, not just for things to start. I have the word cosmos means Greek for world. In the book, this is the book I'm using for a lot of this material. I have it cited at the bottom. It's called When Skeptics Ask, and it's Norm Geisler and Ronald Brooks. Both contribute to this, and it's a handbook on Christian evidences. It's very good. It says, since there is a universe, it must have been caused by something beyond itself. It is based on the law of causality, which says that every limited thing is caused by something other than itself. So, Zane, did you cause yourself to come into existence? No. Right? So, for example, I did not go, as it's been said by someone else, I did not give birth to my mother, because that's nonsensical, because she gave birth to me, and I did not exist prior to her. So I cannot cause myself to come into existence. There's something else caused me to come into existence. Everything that is a changing thing, every limited thing is caused by something other than itself. So we have two different forms of this argument, and that is the universe was caused at the beginning. This is the first form. So here's how the argument goes. Number one, the universe had a beginning. Anything that has a beginning must have been caused by something else. Therefore, the universe was caused by something else, and this cause was God. Okay? Now, some try to say the universe was eternal. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Well, the universe never had a beginning. It always has been, and always will be, but the scientific evidence supports the idea that the universe actually does have a beginning. The second law of thermodynamics states that if the universe that is actually running out of usable energy, it has to do with entropy. I'm not going to get into all that, but basically, if that's the way it's going, then there had to be a place in the past when it actually started. Also, the past cannot be infinite, or else we would not be in today, and that's a really complicated discussion. But the idea is that infinite means there's always another thing added on. You can never run out of infinite numbers, right? Because you could always add one more number, one more book, one more thing. And if it's infinite in the past, there's no way we would have a time today, because there's no, and it gets very complicated. I'm not going to walk through all of that, because I think we all get lost. But the idea is that the universe definitely had a beginning. And since it had a beginning, it had a cause, not itself. Also, the universe, here's the quote. Do you want to go through this, or should we skip it? Okay, let's just go through it quickly. If the past is infinite, which is another way of saying if the universe had always existed without a beginning, then we could never have passed through time to get to today. If the past is an infinite series of moments, and right now is where the series stops, then we would have passed through an infinite series, and that is impossible. If the world never had a beginning, then we could not have reached today. But we have reached today, so time must have begun at a particular point in the past, and today has come to a definite time since then. Therefore, the world is finite, an event after all, and it needs a cause for its beginning. Again, you can dwell on that if you'd like, but we're not going to bother. Second is that the universe needs a cause for its continued existence. If you look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, which we read, it says, "He is before all things, and in him all things consist." So here's our 4 points to go along with this one. Number one, finite. What does that mean? Limited, as in not infinite, but finite, limited. Changing things exist. What's a changing thing? We're all changing things. You're not the same because you're moving through time and space. You're also losing cells, you're gaining weight, you're losing weight, getting older, right? We're all changing. So we are such things. We do exist, by the way. Every finite changing thing must be caused by something else. If limited and changing, then it cannot exist independently. Okay? There cannot be an infinite regress of these causes. You can't keep going back to finite things causing finite things. In other words, if I say, well, what caused me? Well, my mother. Then what caused her? Well, her mother. What caused her? Well, her mother. It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the chicken laid the egg, but in order to get a chicken, you had to have an egg to get a chicken. But in order to get an egg, you had to have a chicken to lay the egg. But how do you have a chicken without an egg? And you could just keep going, and it just doesn't make sense. It just goes back into infinity. So there has to be at some point, and this is the final point, there must be a first uncaused cause of every finite changing thing that exists. At some point, you have to say there's an uncaused cause. You can't just saying this caused this, caused this, caused this into infinity, because we know that the universe had a beginning. So there has to be an uncaused cause. And I think I actually put a key term, is this idea of an uncaused cause. That is something that you ought to become familiar with. You ought to at least think about. God is an uncaused cause. He is acting, and he himself was uncaused. Does that make sense? Have I lost anybody yet? Any questions to this point? Because this is, yes, ma'am. Right. No one caused him. He caused other things, though. He said he is the one who's acting. And so, I mean, we all cause things. Some of you have caused wrecks, right? Some of you have caused other people to come into the world. There have been all kinds of things that you have caused throughout your life. But because you are a finite, limited being, you were caused yourself. So it has some point, it goes back and back and back, and at some point there has to be a point where there's a finite, or there's a unlimited, uncaused cause that begins the process. Sort of? I think this is a powerful argument. Anybody have any thoughts? Or Charles, you want to add anything to that? No? We're good so far? Keep moving. Okay, let's keep moving. Because there's also the argument from design, or the teleological argument. And this, Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14. Who can read that for us? Okay, Thomas?
For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows.
Bible says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. So the argument from design is another very good argument, and that is this: all designs imply a designer. Okay, there is a great design in the universe. Therefore, there must be a great designer of the universe. It's pretty simple. If you're walking along in a field and you find a rock, you might kick the rock, you might look at the rock, you might pick up the rock and throw the rock. If you're a boy, you throw the rock at a bird. But that doesn't mean that rock was designed by anybody. You wouldn't ever think that. But if you walk through and you found an arrowhead, it's still a rock. But it's been designed, even crudely, and you recognize that design. Or, even more profoundly, you find a watch. You think, I can't believe it. This watch just materialized out of the atoms of the atmosphere and appeared here at the ground. There must have been an explosion in a spring factory or something, and now I have myself a watch that just appeared here. I wonder how this came. No, you would never think that. You would assume, well, someone lost their watch. This was designed by somebody. It looks like it was designed by Timex or whoever. And so that is how we think. We understand that idea that design implies a designer. We see a clock or building, and the device necessitates a designer. The greater the design, the greater the designer. Beavers make log dams, but they have never constructed anything like the Hoover Dam, right? So the greater the design, the greater the designer. Universe contains great complexity and also a complex language. There is a quote here: one scientist figured the odds for a one-celled animal to emerge by pure chance at 1 in 10 to the 40,000. That's impossible. So I actually went online and I did the number 1 times 10 to the 40,000. And I copied it, and I pasted it into a Word document, and I made the type really small, and this is what the number looks like. It's 5 pages of zeros. Can you see those zeros? Hardly. That's 1 times 10 to the 40,000. And this is just, so we know that there is, and we're talking about a one-celled animal. We're not talking about all the other things involved. And then you've got the fine-tuning argument that says that, well, there are all these different elements that have to be perfect for us to be here, such as the expansion rate of the universe, such as the distance from the Earth to the sun, distance from the moon to the Earth, the rotation of the Earth, the temperature of the Earth, the way our atmosphere is comprised. Yes, sir. Ten to the 83rd. Yeah, a 10 with 83 zeros after. So that's how many atoms in the known universe. Wow. It's mind-boggling. You can't comprehend that number. Yeah, you can't. It's just beyond our understanding. And so it's not randomness. It's not by chance. And if you talk to someone who's an atheist, you say, well, then what? it's obviously impossible this would happen. They say, but we're here. Exactly. Isn't that enough of an evidence that you ought to reconsider your point? There's a lot here as well. A lot of people have said things like, well, if you give enough time, anything could happen. I'm sure you've heard the illustration. If you have a bunch of monkeys typing on typewriters, eventually they can produce Hamlet. They can't. It would take millions and millions and millions of years of randomness. And then there's actually such thing as a bell curve, which is as you get towards the extremes of the bell curve, it just becomes less and less and less and less likely, to the point where it's not likely. I mean, it's impossible. And then the point I like to bring up when I've talked to people about this, I've actually heard somebody bring up this argument. I say, yes, okay, let's use that illustration. If monkeys were typing on typewriters and they produce Hamlet, where do they get the English language? Where does that? Because now you're assuming a language, and not only that. So what? What does Hamlet mean? Hamlet means something to us in our current culture. It means something to us because we've read it or we've seen it, and it has import. It has meaning. It's not just random words. There's a lot going on there, and so even if it were to be randomly generated, where's the background? Where's the language understanding that makes it understandable? Yes, sir.
Well, probably the most an informed person who would hold the argument that you're alluding to would say that we are here because we are one universe out of practically an infinite number of universes, and so out of that many universes, the chance is not only likely to happen, it's certain to happen. But the problem with the multiverse is, one, it's never been proved, and then two, it requires fine-tuning just to
Right.
its existence.
The idea of a multiverse with infinite variations on a multiverse doesn't solve anything. It just changes it's like saying, well, aliens got us here. Okay. Doesn't solve the problem. You just changed, instead of saying God created it, now aliens created us. Okay. All right. I guess you don't want to be morally responsible to aliens. I got it. Okay. Because talking of morals, we're going to talk really quickly about the axiological argument, which is the argument for moral law. And this is also another one which you can appeal to a person's conscience. Okay, the argument is this: all men are conscious of an objective moral law. Okay? Moral laws imply a moral lawgiver, and therefore there must be a supreme moral lawgiver. Briefly, objective means that it exists outside of ourselves and is not dependent on our perspective. That's what objective means. Whether I want to or not, a literal wall is going to be there. I can pretend like my perception, or I might not see the wall. It doesn't change the fact that if I walk into it, I'm going to hit it. Okay? I might not like the wall. That doesn't change the fact that if I walk into it, I'm going to run into it. I might wish the wall were not there. It doesn't change the fact that if I walk into it, I'm going to hit it. It is there, it is real, it is objective. It is separate from me, and it does not depend on my perception of it. Okay? It is a real thing. So that's the same way in moral laws. I actually have a quote here. Moral laws are different from natural laws. Pay close attention to this, because I think hopefully this will click if you've never thought about this before. Moral laws are different from natural laws. Moral laws don't describe what is. So the law of gravity says 9.8 meters per second squared is the acceleration rate of gravity on Earth. So you could drop a mass and it will fall at a certain rate. And you can measure that. How do we know that? Nobody theorized it. They got out their measuring tools and they measured it. So they measured what the mass acceleration is, and that's gravity. But moral law is different. It's not what is. They prescribe what ought to be. You see that? This is what ought to be versus what is. They are not simply describing the way men behave and are not known by observing what men do. Instead, moral laws tell us what men ought to do, whether they are doing it or not. And this is very profound. Why is it that all men and women have an innate sense of something is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway? That is very powerful. In talking I get to talk to people like this more than some because of dealing with college students and that age group a lot. A lot of the discussion is, well, you don't need God. I don't need God to be a moral person. I can do moral things. Being being an atheist. I'm like, that's fine. You could do that, sure. I didn't say you had to believe in God to do moral things, but can you do moral things without God actually existing? Because if you do that thing, who's to say it's moral? Or why is it moral without any kind of objective morality? Why is my morality? Is it just whoever's strongest, their morality wins? I mean, people have thought that way before. Stalin thought that way. Hitler thought that way. A lot of people thought that way, and their morality killed other people because it was might makes right, or whatever the case might be. This is most people recognize this. It's not society's discussion. It's not society comes up with these rules either. So if there were four men and in a room and they all decided that stealing from one of the men was morally okay, would it be morally okay? Of course not. So the innate sense of morality gives us the evidence that God is a moral God and He's the moral lawgiver. The last one is the argument from being, or the ontological argument. And this argument was first put forth by a guy named Ansel. And this is a little tricky, okay? And I actually have a video. Jeff, I don't know if this is kind of last minute, but it's actually, if you pull up the audio-video website, the Chrome, on the Mac, I put it under a bookmark. On a Wednesday night, you'll see it, a folder. If you can't find it, let me know. The argument is this. Whatever perfection can be attributed to the most perfect being possible, the most perfect being conceivable, must be attributed to it. Otherwise, it would not be the most perfect being conceptual. Okay? So if something is the most perfect being, then whatever attribute is attributed to it, it must have that attribute. Necessary existence is a perfection which can be attributed to the most perfect being. In order to be the most perfect being, you have to be. Therefore, necessary existence must be attributed to the most perfect being. Do you see it, Jeff? Okay. I might run back there because this is, I don't know if we have enough time. It's about a 5-minute video. We don't. This is an argument that I'm not super huge fan of, mostly because it sounds like a wordplay argument or like a trick. But there are some people like Plantinga is a big philosopher, and many others who actually say this is a very good argument. And the argument goes something like this. Since God is a perfect being, in order to be a perfect being, He has to exist, therefore He exists. So it sounds a little bit like like you're assuming your conclusion. But there's actually a complicated philosopher way of talking about this, about possible worlds. Wherein, if there's a possible, anybody ever heard of this? No? Okay. We'll talk about it next time. How about that? It'll be a few weeks. But if you want to, you can go home. Reasonable Faith puts out a video about this. You can look up arguments on the ontological argument. And it might interest you, it might not. If I were you and if I were discussing this with someone who's not a believer, I wouldn't worry about this one. It's an interesting philosophical argument. It's one of the classic arguments, but I don't think it's the most persuasive. I've never had very much success with this one, trying to argue with someone, or argue or debate with someone. Any questions so far? We're not going to get into the rest of this, what kind of God exists tonight. Obviously, we've run out of time. Anybody? We have a couple minutes. Anybody have any questions or thoughts or additional insight on these kind of things? We're talking about the arguments for the existence of God. Yes, sir.
I think one of the fundamental things that you can do with these arguments is when you're talking to someone who's an atheist, particularly someone who's into the sciences, get them to the understanding that what they believe is faith, because they don't like that.
Right.
They want to believe that everything, that their science and your faith.
Right. Okay, so let me say something about that. Defining what faith is crucial. So faith is not believing something without evidence. Okay? Faith is trusting in something, whatever it might be. So they might they'll often say, well, you believe in God and that's faith. I believe in science. Okay. Better illustration is the illustration, my favorite one is of when someone jumps out of an airplane with a parachute. They put their trust, they put their faith in the person who packed their chute, or else they wouldn't jump. Okay, they don't know how to pack the chute. They're not an expert. And the truth is, everyone who does science is trusting other people who do science. Because if you study this stuff, it is incredibly specialized. And so people are relying on other people's expertise and other people's work. And so if they don't know that stuff, they know their area very well, but they don't know anybody else's area super well. So they're studying their own area, and they're having faith that everyone else is doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so you're exactly right in pointing out that, look, you can't prove these things. These are things that you take by faith based on your trust in other people. This is a you're making faith propositions. And that's a really good point. And getting to the idea that faith is not a lesser thing. They think that they're proven, that science is proven. People worship science. There was even a march for science recently. I don't know if you saw that in the news. There's a difference between observable, testable, repeatable science and naturalism, which is really what that is. So naturalism says there's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as supernatural things. Thanks for your attention. I hope this wasn't too dry. And we'll get and do some more of these things. We'll talk about some of the things that you'll probably face with people you talk to at work or at school. And I hope that this encourages you and builds up your faith and helps you have a little bit more confidence as you talk about these things. Let's close with a word of prayer.